Okay, so topic of today is the whirlwind tour of authentication and authorization in ASP.NET Core 2. I want to highlight that we are in Core 2 land. Hopefully you're not on Core 1, because anything that I show you here will not work in Core 1, because between 1 and 2, they rewrote the entire world of authentication in ASP.NET. So it's all about Core 2. So my name is Klug. I work as a software developer at a company called 1337, which means 1337 in Swedish, in Stockholm. I've been doing web development for the last 18, 20 years something, and basically on the Microsoft platform all the way. So I've been started out in the good old days when it was classical ASP, when it was just everything in one file, and it was interesting. And then through web forms, which was interesting. And then MVC, and now it's come back, and it's basically gone full turn again, and we're back into something that I recognize again, and it's getting lighter and lighter. I'm not going to do a whole bunch about slides and everything, because I won't have time to do my demos, so I'm just going to go demo. So we're going to demo for the next 59 minutes. Before I will mention that, I'll mention it now, I remember it. Code that I am demoing is available, so you can actually go and download it off these links here. So there's the code for today's demo, and if I forget to mention it at the end of the session, it's available here. And the demos and all this stuff that I'm talking about today, as well as a bunch of other stuff, is available as a Pluralsight course. So if you're on Pluralsight, there is a course built around what I'm going to show you today. Other than that, I'm going to do pretty much what I do in the Pluralsight course, which is show you step by step how you integrate different forms of authentication in ASP.NET Core. So I'm not going to show you the underpinnings of how authentication works in ASP.NET Core. I'm not going to show you the big picture. I'm going to show you if you need authentication to do local authentication, do this. If you need to do Twitter, do this. If you need to do Facebook, do this. If you need to do Azure AD B2C, do this. And finally, if you want to do identity server, do this. So I'm going to be very practical about this is the stuff you need to type together to work, not a bunch of fluff. If you want fluff, there are other sessions, probably really good fluff. But this is going to be pretty down to what you need to do. So I just realized that you cannot see what I've got on screen, right? Let's change this so you see a bit more. Let's try that. Can you see that? In the back? Ish. There's a one thumb up. I'm going to go with that. So I've got a couple of demos here. I've got a web project. The web project is ridiculously simple. I haven't done anything to it. It's a very simple ASP.NET Core MVC website. If we have a look at it, you'll see my amazing design skills. Like that. It looks like the rest of the internet does. It's just a bootstrap website. Very, very simple. It's got a register button, a login button, and if I go to a place called user info, there is an endpoint here that I can't access because it requires authentication. That's it. I don't care about the website. I don't care what it looks like. I want to show you how we do authentication, right? But the application, if you are wondering, it looks like this. It has ASP.NET MVC. It's using static files and MVC. It's got two controllers. There's a home controller that shows a view, user info thing that shows a view that requires authorization. And it has an auth controller that has all of the views and stuff to do the authentication, but none of it is implemented. Or parts of it is, but the important stuff is not. My first demo is, and just to make sure that the room is active in here, how many of you are doing local logins today and actually taking care of your own user database with username and passwords? A ton of really brave people. I try to get away from that, but we'll start out in that area because I know that a lot of people still do that. And then we'll move into other forms of authentication afterwards. The cool thing is that it doesn't matter what kind of authentication you're setting up, it all starts in the same way. You go up to your services, or your configure services here. You say services, add authentication. Sweet, done. Not quite, but we're good way on the way to actually getting authentication. Add authentication will give us the basic services we need for authentication. These are like the foundational services that we need. And after that, out of add authentication, we get an interface called or a class called authentication builder. This is what we need to use to configure the different forms of authentication that we want to use. So I'm going to use local logins, so that means cookie. So I'm just going to go and say .add cookie, like that. Cookie authentication configured and done. You can go in and make more modifications in here. We can go in and do, in my case, I'm going to do this. So I add some configuration in here, just telling it that when the user is required to log in, if I go to a web page that requires authorization and authentication, send the user off to /auth/login to do the login part. And if I get to a page, this is nice, I like this. If you come to a page and you haven't logged in, you're not authenticated at all, you get sent to the login page. If you come to a page and you don't have access, which basically means you're logged in, but you don't have the right requirements or the right claims to access that resource, you can get sent to another place. Previously, you would always be sent to the login page. So it didn't matter if you didn't have the right credentials, the fact that you weren't logged in, you would end up in the same place all the time. Now you can split them out. So I have these two different ones. If you want to log in, go to auth/login. Otherwise, go to auth/access denied. Next, once I've got my services configured, and this is the step that I continuously forget even though I do this on a fairly regular basis, go down to your configure method and do app.use authentication. That adds authentication to the request pipeline. Just configuring the services to actually handle authentication is not enough. We need to get into the request pipeline to make sure that people get authenticated as they go in and out of the system. That is all we do. I am now done with all my configuration. I don't need to do anything else to make this work because I have cheated. I have an iUser service. I have a stupid service that contains username and passwords. You will need to authenticate the user somehow, right? Once I've got that, we can go over to my auth controller. We'll just outline that, and you'll see that it has methods or endpoints for login. So there are two for logins. That's the one that presents the login form. That's the one that takes care of getting the credentials and authenticating the user. This is the register endpoint. So basically, this shows the registration page. This handles the registration. Log out. Well, obviously, it logs you out. And there's the access denied one. So all of these are already implemented. So there's already a view for registration because I don't want to show you how to write HTML. What I want to show you is the second step, which is once the user has filled in the registration stuff and wants to register a user, I take a look at this, and it looks at the view state, or model state rather, to see that that is valid. So I've filled out all of the fields. If I filled out all of the fields, I don't do a bunch of validation in here. I'm just going to trust that everything is fine. Once again, it's a demo. My suggestion would be to never trust your user and actually validate stuff. But for the demo, I'm just accepting any input. That's fine. Then I go to my user service, and I say, can you please add a new user? This is the name, the email, and the password that the person wants to use. That's it. I get a user back. Once I've got that, I can go and create a list of claims. So everything in ASP.NET Core, and actually earlier versions of ASP.NET as well, ASP.NET as well, that has to do with authentication is based on claims. So I create a list of claims that for this user, I'm saying that the user's identity or name identifier is the email address. The name of the user is the username, and the email is the email. So I give it 3 claims. That's it. Fairly simple. Then once I got my claims, I can take those claims, and I can create a claims identity, saying that here are the claims for the user. Can you please create an identity for me with those claims? And I'm doing it using cookie authentication. That second parameter is for some reason not mandatory. So you can actually skip passing that in, like that. If you do that, everything works and then breaks. So it will compile and it will run, but it won't actually authenticate the user. So that thing needs to be filled out as well, telling it this is the authentication method that I'm using. Finally, I create a principal by passing in my identity. And once I've got that, I can go ahead and say HTTP context.signinAsync, which is an extension method, passing in the principal for the user. And after that, I can just go and say, cool, the user is now signed in. Can you please redirect to the user information action on the home controller? This will make sure, or rather, calling this will make sure that the services that I registered before goes ahead and sets the cookies and validates it and all of that stuff, validating incoming cookies, setting the cookies, and all of that. All we need to do is call this, and we sign in the user. Take that, go back out here, and we load up the page again. Go to register. I get my auth/register endpoint. I get my registration page, so I fill out my information here. I give it a password, press register, and it complains because I am a moron. Actually, kind of good to show it because you might run into it. I configured, where is it? Here. I configured my authentication, but I didn't actually tell it. I registered my authentication service and I registered my cookie authentication, but I didn't actually tell the system what authentication provider I wanted to use. I didn't say that I wanted to use cookie. I just said there is a cookie authentication thing that can be used, but I'm not telling it specifically to use it. So I need to go in and say, there's a couple of ways to do this. If you look here, I can either call it using a string, telling it, this is the scheme you should be using at all times. Or you can go in and have a much more complicated configuration. In my case, I want to use cookie. So I'm going to go cookie authentication defaults dot authentication scheme. So all of our authentication schemes, in this case cookie, will have a name. If I don't specifically set the name in my options here, they will get a default name. The default name is available, in this case, under cookie authentication defaults dot authentication scheme. So all of our schemes will have a defaults class that contains the default name of that scheme. So by setting this, I'm telling the system that whenever I try to register a user, do it using the cookie authentication scheme. Whenever a user comes to my web page and tries to access something, look at the cookie authentication handler to see if that handler can authenticate the user in some way, in this case cookies. So I'm telling it to always use cookie authentication. The annoying thing that I think I managed to do now is that I managed to put my application in a screwed up situation because I now have a user registered, so I can't register a new one and I can't log in. Because if I go and put myself in here again, actually, if I just do Chris1 tests, I have a check that only allows one email address. That works. So I come in here now. I am signed in. You can see here my username is Chris Klug. You can see my claims. There are 3 of them. I've got the name identifier, the name, and the email address. So all you need to do is register the services and call that sign in async, and you're done. You don't have to do anything else. Pretty simple way to get local logins working. But I can't log out because the logout button is not there yet. If we look at the UI for it, my logout page, if we go to home, user information, my logout page is a little form. I'm using forms and posts for my logouts. There's a sweet feature in, for example, Chrome that will make Chrome follow certain URLs to pre-cache pages for you. And if it goes and pre-caches your logout page, means that it actually logs the user out for you. So if you do a get to your logout endpoint, you might end up with the user getting logged out every time he logs into your page, which is a fairly crappy user experience. So by putting it as a post, I require it to be pushed as a button and do a HTTP post instead. And I'm posting to logout action on the auth controller. If we look at the auth controller, we look at the logout method. It's an HTTP post. It's called logout, and implementation is actually pretty simple. All I have to do in here is, I didn't even need a sign. I didn't need one of these, because this is all I need to do. Await HTTP context.signout_async redirect action. All of the stuff of removing the cookie and all of that stuff that you might want to do to get this working, if you just call signout_async, that will make sure that the cookie authentication handler goes and does whatever it needs to clear out the currently logged in user. So in this case, that thing will remove your cookie for you. So with that in place, I should be able to just go out here, press logout, and ASP.NET Core is really fast, by the way. Once you've built it, it takes a while for it to build. So there it is, I'm now logged out. So registering and logging out, fairly simple, right? Logging in is my next part, which is actually not much harder. I'm just going to take, because it's very similar to this code here. So I'm going to take that code, I'm going to do extract method, and call it sign in user. And I have a serious case of OCD. I'm going to move this to the end, just because my private methods should be at the bottom. And yes, I do have issues. And in my login here, in my post, what I do in that is I check my model state is valid. Then I authenticate the email and password using my service. If the user has been, the email and password is correct, I get a user back. Otherwise, I set up a model error and send it back. And finally, down here, I just do return await sign in user, passing in the user. And then that takes the user, shoves it down here, sets up the claims, logs the user in using sign in async. So if I go to login, this should give me a login page. I should be able to set this up, and I should be able to log in. I got my user account. So it took me, I've been speaking for 15 minutes. I introduced myself. So it takes less than 10 minutes to actually set up authentication in ASP.NET using local logins, as long as you have a way to authenticate a user. In my world, that means that I actually, weirdly enough, in a lot of my applications, don't ask me why, have hard-coded things where I basically just check the username and password against a thing in my app settings, because I only need one user for a simple little thing. That takes this long to implement. But the thing is, nobody really does local logins anymore, right? It's all about doing social logins. How many of you guys are doing Facebook logins or Twitter logins or Gmail or something like that today? That was way less. That was like a few. Okay. Come see me after the session, and I will explain to you why it's awesome to do social logins. But I'll show you at least how simple it is, and maybe you'll do it in the future. There are some benefits of doing it using social, and it seems like more and more people are moving in that direction. Luckily enough, that is just as simple to implement as this. All you have to do is you go into here after the add authentication part. You go in, and we'll do an add one of these. External auth. So I'm just adding in a call to add Facebook and a call to add Twitter. And also a little tip, if you are doing social logins, your secrets, the app secret and consumer secrets, are not supposed to be shown to anyone but your own team, and preferably as few of those as possible. So a big screen at a conference while also being recorded is definitely not the right place. You cannot use this for anything. It's a demo application, and I might reset my secrets after showing it like this, but they're supposed to be secret. So we just call this, and that adds all we need. That adds all of the functionality we need to do authentication using Facebook and using Twitter. Next step, I need to go to my, let's go to my register page. No, actually, let's go to my login page, which is up here. And in my login page, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add, if I can find the right snippet that I want. I'm going to add this piece of code here. First of all, I'm going ahead and injecting an authentication scheme provider. That is one of those services that we get by calling add authentication. And it gives us a service that allows me to access all of the different authentication schemes that are registered at the current point. So I'm taking that, and down here I'm setting up and saying, for every one of the schemes that's available in get request handler schemes async, basically give me all the schemes, I want to put up an A tag, a link. I want to call login external on the authentication or the auth controller, and I want to pass in the name of the scheme. So it's going to pass in this case, Twitter, and it's going to pass in Facebook. And then I'm going to write out the scheme display name here, so it's going to say Twitter and Facebook on the web page. Once that is in place, I need to go to my auth controller, and somewhere up here under login, let's do it here. I'm going to add this thing here. So I'm adding another route here that's called /login external /ID. So the ID is going to be the name of the authentication handler that I want to use. As I said, Twitter or Facebook in this case, but it could be any other provider that you've registered as well. And then I'm calling http context.challengeAsync, basically saying, send a challenge to the user and get the user to log in. And I want to log in using this thing here. I want to sign in using the one that the user has defined. And one other little thing, I need to pass in an authentication properties and say, when you're done signing in, redirect the user to /userinfo. If you don't pass this in, which might potentially have happened once or twice while I've been doing it, it is smart enough to say redirect back to where I am right now. So it means that I click the link, I get to this page here, this thing shoves me off to Facebook, I authenticate myself at Facebook, it redirects me back to this link here, which then sends me back to Facebook, which says I'm already authenticated and sends me back to this endpoint, which sends me back to Facebook, and then it goes on and on and on until Chrome goes and says that you're a moron and stops allowing redirects. And I think it's like 25 redirects before it stops or something like that. So adding this will make sure that I don't end up back here, which I really don't want to. Save that, and we go out here and we press login. You'll see now that it just adds Facebook and Twitter down here. And I could have gone in and I can just go back to my services and I can just call add Google. And I only need to make that change in the service registration, and all of a sudden Google will pop up here, and all of a sudden I can authenticate using Google. So I can configure my different service providers using the services without having to make any changes to my UI. I press Facebook. I get sent off to Facebook. It asks me if I want to let authDemo receive my public profile and my email address. And since I know the guy who built this application, and he's really nice, I'm going to say yes. And I come back here, and you can see that I'm not getting a bunch of new claims. So I'm getting other claims, because I'm not doing my own claims. In this case, I'm getting Facebook claims, and Facebook will give me a name identifier, an email address, a name, a given name, and a surname. If I were to do the same thing using Twitter, I will get other claims. And that is kind of a problem, that I'm getting different claims for different providers, so I would all the time in my application have to look at what claims are available right now. So if I want to use an email address, that's fine if the user is logged in using Facebook, but Twitter doesn't actually give you an email address. So if the user signs in using, or logs in using Twitter, I can't use the email address and so on. So it becomes a little bit complicated with different social providers, right? So what we normally do is we put in a step in between and say, I will make sure that the user provides at least enough for me to know what I need, and then basically normalize the claims that are available. And the way that we do that, I'm just going to log out here. The way that we do that is we go back here to the startup. And at the bottom here, I'm actually going to call add cookie again. I'm going to add another cookie authentication handler, but I'm going to call it temp cookie. So that's a new handler. It's there. It will handle cookie authentication and all of it, but it will never be called right now. It's never going to be used by anyone. So what I can do is I can go in here and I can say to the Twitter one, whenever somebody signs in or authenticates using Twitter, sign in the user using the temp cookie one, not the real one. Don't sign them in using the cookie authentication one, which is the true one for the application. Sign them in using this other thing over here. And I will do the same thing for Facebook. So both of them will sign them in using another provider that I'm not using at the moment. So they will get a cookie, but they will not get the cookie that's automatically identified. So the user won't actually be properly logged into the system, but I will still have a cookie with information about them. And then I'm going to go over to this thing here. And I'm going to change the login external thing here to auth/register external, like that. And I'm going to go, so that means that once the user is logged in, they'll come back, they'll get logged in with the temporary cookie, and then get redirected to register external. If we look at register external, that is basically an endpoint here that says, can you please, HTTP context.authenticate async says, can you authenticate this user using the temp cookie specifically? Can you go and see if the temp cookie handler can give me information about this user? If that doesn't succeed, somebody has obviously ended up at this endpoint without being in the right state, so I'm just redirecting them back to home. If that is the case, that somebody is temporarily signed in at the moment, I take that user information, that authResult.principal, and I go ahead and call my user service and say, can you please register this user using this name identifier here? Oh, sorry, can you find this user? I'm reading it wrong. Can I find this user using this thing here is the unique identifier for the user for Facebook. So can you find this Facebook user in my application? If that is the case, if I can find a user in my system that has logged in before using the Facebook identifier, then I basically sign the user in. If not, it's a new user. So I have clicked on it. I've never been to the application before. The application don't know who I am. What I need to do is I need to show them a web page where they can input the information that I need. So I want to collect the name and the email. And what I do is I use the temporary information and say, if there is an email claim, please pre-populate the email input box with the email. If there is a name, pre-populate that with the name. And then I have another one here. Register external post. Once you've filled that thing in, you come back to this page again. And once again, we check, is there a temporary cookie for this user? So have this user temporarily signed in. If not, go off to the home page, I don't care. If there is, check that the model state is valid. After that, add an external user to this system. So I'm telling the system that I want to register a user. His or her name is that, email is that, and the unique identifier is this value here, which is the name identifier I got from the social identity provider. And finally, I sign in the user. Signing in an external user is pretty much what you'd expect. Why did I all of a sudden zoom in? We have this thing here called sign in external. So all I do when I sign in an external user is I first ask them to sign out the temporary cookie. So I'm signing out the temporary sign-in that we've got, and then I sign them in for real. So for a period of time, they're going to be temporarily signed into the system using a cookie. But once they've provided all of the information that I need, I transfer that temporary sign-in to a proper real sign-in, and they're welcome into my system. That means that if I go back out here, and we press register, actually, if I press register, we need to have one of these. That wasn't one I wanted. Oh, that one, and we want to have external providers. That's the one. So we need to provide the buttons out here, right? So I'm just putting the buttons in here as well. So I go Facebook. I get sent off to Facebook, but I've already logged into Facebook and already accepted that this application gets access, right? So I get sent straight back. I don't have to go and sign into Facebook again because Facebook knows that I trust this awesome developer that's built this application. So I come back here, I get that temporary cookie. So I'm temporarily signed in now, but I won't actually be able to access anything because I'm not signed in. I'm only temporarily signed in using a temporary cookie. I get this form here, which pre-populates my information here with the information that I got from Facebook. And then I press register. That registers me in the system as a local user as well, or my information in the local system, and signs me in properly and issues only the claims that I'm expecting. So I've now normalized it. So no matter if I log in with Twitter or Facebook or some other provider, in the end, I'm going to end up with these 3 claims. And whenever somebody registers, I can make sure that I collect the information that I need independently of what provider that I'm using. Does that make sense? Ish, at least. This has been built into ASP.NET MVC for ages. It's just that their template is a little bit hard to follow along, according to me. Okay, so we've got local logins and we've seen social providers, right? There's no way, apparently, to go to a conference and not show you Azure stuff, I've heard. So I'm going to go ahead and set up this thing here to start a project, and I'm going to show you how to use Azure AD B2C. So Azure AD B2C is business to consumer. It's not an Azure Active Directory as such. It kind of is, but it kind of isn't. But it offers the ability to do what I just did. It offers us to do local logins using email address, but it also allows us to register social identity providers and all of that. But we don't have to care. We can just click things in the Azure portal and set things up, and then we let Azure handle all of the stuff of collecting information and communicating with Facebook and all of that. All we do is we make sure we communicate with Azure. So to do that, I have an empty application again. I go to the startup. Say here, it's pretty much the same thing I had before I started adding all of my CRUD to it. We do services.add authentication. Same thing as before, no difference. But this time I actually want to use OpenID Connect. So OpenID Connect is a standard protocol that we can use to authenticate users using different services. Unfortunately, Microsoft decided that they were not going to support OpenID Connect default, like everyone else is doing. They added some stuff on top of it, which makes it a bit harder to use. They support what they call profiles. So normally, you just send off the user to an endpoint and say, can you please authenticate this user? What Microsoft is offering with B2C is they don't only do authentication, they also support registration, profile updating, and things like that. So they offer other services than just authentication using something they call profiles. So a profile is an action that you can do using OpenID Connect at Microsoft. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to name my provider here, weirdly enough, B2C_1_sign_in. Reason for that is that this mimics the name of my profile that I have set up in Azure. B2C_1_ is something that Microsoft adds automatically, so you can't decide that. Why? I have no clue. B2C I can understand, the _1_ I have no clue. And then I named it sign in because this profile supports signing in users. It doesn't allow users to sign up or change their profile information or anything. It only does sign in. Once I've named it, and I name it the same thing as my profile because later on I need them to be named the same thing for it to work. And then I'm going to go in here and I'm going to say options, and then I can configure stuff. I'm going to need to configure one OpenID Connect authentication handler for every profile that I support. So if I support sign in, sign up, sign in and up, edit profile, and whatever. So I'm going to end up with like 3 or 4 or 5 different profiles. I need to register 3 or 4 or 5 different endpoints or handlers. And that means repetition, and I really dislike repetition. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create this helper method that looks like this. ADB2C options config, that's the one. So this method here, it takes an OpenID Connect options object and the name of a policy. And then it configures all of the things that we need to get it configured to work with Azure, which means it gives it an address of where my metadata endpoint is with the policy at the end. And it sets up some redirects. It says, once you signed out, redirect here. When you come back from Azure, use this address. So every one of these needs to have a different endpoint address and a few little things. So this helps me set everything up. And all it does, it basically sets up a unique callback path and signed out callback path for every one of the policies. This needs to be there for it to work. Using that, I can then go ahead here and I can call configure OpenID options, pass in my options object and my magical B2C_1_sign_in. And then we just need to do that for my other ones as well. But I'm not going to type that out. I'm really sorry. That's just not me. So we're going to do ADB2C op, and I get no IntelliSense. Let's try this. ADB2C config, that's the one. So I do the same thing for one policy called B2C_1_sign_in_or_up. and one called, yeah, you get it, for sign up, right? So I have 3 different endpoints, one for signing in, one for signing up, and one for either signing in or signing up. And these will only do authentication, so they will only authenticate users, they won't sign anybody in. So I need to add my cookie here. So I need a cookie middleware or cookie authentication to actually sign the user into my application and keep them signed in my end. So OpenID Connect will authenticate the users, cookie will keep the user signed in. And instead of just telling it one thing here, I'm going to go ahead and say AD B2C auth defaults, that's the one. And I'm going to tell it here, say that whenever somebody comes and authenticates themselves, so once they've been to Azure AD and they come back, sign them in using the cookie authentication middleware. That's fine. When somebody asks to be signed out, sign them out using the cookie authentication handler. Whenever somebody asks to be signed in, rather I go to an endpoint where the user is not authenticated, send them somewhere using this scheme here, so the sign in or sign up one. And finally, when a user comes to the web page, please have a look at their cookie using the cookie authentication handler to see if the user is authenticated at this moment. So we can give them all of these different configuration things. In this case, I'm telling it to use cookie authentication for everything except when I need to challenge the user to log in. And finally, I need to make sure that I add this thing here, use authentication, like that. So it's a bunch of configuration, but that's about it. And all of this configuration stuff down here is available on the Azure website. It's pretty well documented. And after that, I can go to my auth controller. And my auth controller is obviously going to be a lot simpler because it doesn't have any forms. It doesn't handle user postbacks and stuff like that. All I need to do is add the functionality to send the user to the right endpoint in Azure. So in here, I'm going to add AD B2C login challenge. So I'm going to return a challenge here and tell it that, can you please log in the user? And can you log them in or use the B2C underscore one underscore sign underscore in to sign in users? So that's the name of my authentication handler. And if you want to register, that is actually a different one. So it's going to be sign up. That's my other handler that handles signing up. And for signing out, we'll do await HTTP context dot sign out async to sign out the user. That will sign out the user from my local cookie, but I actually want to sign out the user in Azure as well. I don't want to keep the user signed in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say ADB2C sign out. And here is the whole thing of me naming my handlers a bit weirdly. When you sign in or get a user authenticated using Azure AD B2C, there will be a claim in the claims collection with the name of the profile that I used when I signed the user in or authenticated the user. So if I go ahead and authenticate the user using the profile called B2C underscore one underscore sign underscore in, Azure will authenticate the user and send the user back with a claim containing that value. So I know which endpoint I need to use when I sign out the user, because I need to sign out the user at the same endpoint. That name, the name of the profile I used, is available in a claim called TFP. So I pull out the name of the profile that was used when I authenticated the user. I take that name, and then I say, can you please sign out this user using this profile here? And that profile is the same name as my authentication handler. Does that make sense? Ish, at least. Yes? Yes. So yes, you remove the possibility of doing single sign-on. If you want to skip that, you can sign the user out locally only. But that means that when you click login again, you're going to bounce off Azure, and Azure is going to say you're already logged in, and it will send a cookie back. So if you have two applications using the same Azure AD B2C, there will be single sign-on between those two applications. Which I guess is a good thing and a really crap thing, depending on how you see it. I think it's supposed to be a good thing. So, taking this, pressing register, because I don't actually have a user in Azure, which is BS, because I actually demoed this before and forgot to delete my user. So I can't press Facebook. We're going to try something here. This might fail. I'm really sorry if it does, but I'm going to press email. This means that I'm actually signing up and creating a local user in my Azure AD here. When you sign in using Facebook or Twitter in this case, you also get a local user in an AD in Azure. But I'm going to create my own user here. And what I like about this is that if I go here and I press send verification code, and I wait, there it is. This is dangerous because I've gone down here and started typing my password and not looked at my screen. And then all of a sudden it shows up the verification code box, and all of a sudden I'm typing my password in clear text to the entire audience. Pretty crappy solution. Cool thing about this, if I create a new password, let's create something semi-serious, like that, and a display name. Verification code. I used to have a phone. Actually, this is another one of those I should probably not. What can go wrong with showing your personal email folder to the entire audience? There it is, look at that, verify your email address, here's my code. I copy that out. So Microsoft will take care of verifying, did that not work? There it is. Of verifying my email address as well. So I don't have to do all of that stuff, Microsoft does it for me automatically. I go create. I get sent back here, and I get all of these claims. So this is my user, yes. I have no idea what the upper limit is, but you can probably shove in a couple of 100,000 before Azure croaks. Then I assume you're paying for it as well, because I haven't looked at the payment model, because I don't need that for one user for a demo. But I don't see that there being a reasonable upper limit that will cause a problem for you. Just remember that once you make it an Azure AD B2C, it's not a regular AD. They're two different things, so they need to be handled differently. If I sign out from this, you don't see it, but I'm actually being sent off to Azure to sign out, and then I come back here again. And if I press login now, and I press Facebook, because I already have a Facebook user, I'm going to get thrown to Facebook. I've already approved that user. User comes back to Azure AD, which sends me back here with all of my claims. Last thing I want to show you, I'm not going to go all the way through, but if I go for register, and I select Twitter, it asks me if I want to authorize this demo here to access my Twitter account, and I will say authorize. The reason I want to show you this is because you end up at this. So the stuff that I had about actually collecting information using a temp cookie and all of that is handled for me up here. So they will do all of this and store all of the information securely in an AD, and I don't have to care. And yes, you can change the image on the left-hand side, I think. You should be able to. I just never tried it. Okay, so Azure AD B2C is awesome, and Azure AD works as well. I must admit, though, that I tend to gravitate towards not using Azure AD B2C or local logins. I tend to gravitate towards using Identity Server. So Brock Allen, who's here as a speaker, builds a product called Identity Server. It's an open source identity server. That sounds really stupid when you say it, but you get what I mean. It's a thing you just install. It's really easy. You get it's a middleware you download into to your application. You register it. It's a NuGet package. You download the UI because the UI is separate. That's something you can download. It's completely skinnable. You can do whatever UI you want to it. But it has all of the stuff you need for an OpenID Connect endpoint. So it is a fully working identity provider that supports a bunch of protocols out of the box. And your effort to set it up is get a NuGet package, go into your startup. Did that say that is? My startup file is now copyrighted to Brock Allen, so they own my computer now. In here, you'll see that I set up some identity server services stuff. So I say services.add identity server. I set up some stuff about my identity server regarding errors and stuff and the issue URI, which is obviously supposed to be a URI, not a string. In this case, I just add a test user. Normally, you'll have a service that's backed by a database with all of your users and stuff, so you can plug in your user store. It's called add test user for the simple reason that it's supposed to be for test, not for you using it in production. And then it's got things here like identity resources, API resources. So if you want to know more about resource management and API resources and stuff, talk to Brock. But basically, it's a way to say, what can a user request from this endpoint? So what can I ask? And all of that is configured, in this case, in a JSON file out here. So out here, we can find a bunch of other profile stuff that's being set up. So yes, there's a bit of config going on in here. But in the big picture, it's actually quite easy to set up. Nicely enough, you need a key. You need a public-private key to sign your tokens. If you don't want to sit around for dev purposes and just want to quickly get this started, you can actually just call add developer signing credentials, and it will generate credentials. It will generate a certificate for you and store it. I've got mine here in your project, and it will basically have a key for you. So it will sign and do everything properly with a developer level thing, so you don't have to go and create keys and stuff just to get started. So it's very easy to get started with. And finally, we just add identity server to our request pipeline, and we're done. I have a fully working identity server, and I have a web here, which is going to be a relying party. So this thing is going to be the one that uses identity server to authenticate users. It looks fairly much like the application I've shown you so far, which means that it looks like crap. It has one little feature change, and it has a spa. So I have a single page application in here. And calling it a spa when it's about 15 lines of JavaScript in a web page is probably overstating it a bit, but it's there. And if I go to that, it has a call API method that calls a web API in my application. So to sign in the user, we're back to doing what we've done before, pretty much. I open up my empty thing here. We call services.add authentication to add authentication services. We do add OpenID Connect, because we want to do OpenID Connect authentication. Because, as I said, Identity Server supports OpenID Connect, which is a standard. So you can just use the default OpenID Connect handler. And then we'll do IDS config. And we set some configuration parameters in here. There are a couple of things I want to mention in here. One is we need to set up the client ID, for example, to be the same client ID that's configured in the identity server and all of that. But the main important thing to mention here is this. I am, for the sake of being a demo, hosting my identity provider without SSL encryption. So it's on HTTP port 5000. I have to manually go in and tell my configuration that I do not require HTTPS. By default, it is going to tell you that I'm not going to go there because it's not using HTTPS. If any of you use an identity provider without HTTPS at any point in your life, I will hunt you down. I will find you in your sleep, and I will Freddy Krueger your ass to the point where you will never forget to do this again. You do not, at any point, put identity stuff online without SSL. Are we okay? Can we agree on that? If there's one thing you take away from this, is that you don't do what I'm doing now. Which might be a bad thing to demo, but it causes problems moving things around with an SSL cert for a demo on different ports and stuff. So I've left it like this, but I do want to highlight, don't do this. The second part that I want to mention that's interesting is save tokens. If you don't set this to true, what save tokens does is that it saves the original issued token from the identity provider in a cookie. If you don't save that token, which is the default is good because it means that you're not sending an extra cookie back and forth with a bunch of information. If you don't save it, once you redirect the user to identity server to sign out, identity server won't actually redirect the user back to your application. Because it's going to say, I have no idea who this user is. I'm not going to allow him to be redirected somewhere that I don't know is safe. So you need to turn this on for automatic redirects to work. And finally, I hook this events thing up here and say on remote failure, redirect the user to /. If the user gets to the sign-in page and decides to press cancel instead of OK and signing in, the user actually comes back and gets an on remote failure, which gives you a yellow screen of death in your page if you don't handle it. And I don't believe that the user pressing cancel is actually a mistake. So this thing just says, if the user comes back after a remote failure, redirect them to the home page again. And once again, it's only authentication. For actual keeping the user authenticated or user signed in, I need to add the cookie authentication to then. So I need to have cookie once again. And I need to go up here, and we need to say IDS auth defaults. Once again, I'm just telling it that for every scenario except challenging the user to sign in, use cookie authentication. If the user needs to be challenged to sign in, use the OpenID Connect one. I'm just telling it what to use. That's kind of okay. And once we got that, we need to remember this, which I'm obviously about to forget. Use authentication to get it into the request pipeline. As you can see, it's pretty repetitive. No matter if we're using OpenID Connect or Azure AD B2C or Twitter or Facebook or local, it's pretty much the same steps. It's all a pretty nice API for that. Go to the auth controller. I need to do some stuff here. Well, first of all, I need to challenge the user. When you log in, please just go ahead and log in, cause a challenge, redirect user to user info when he's done. To sign out. First, sign out the user using the default authentication handler using here. Just sign out. That's the cookie one. And then after that, go ahead and sign out the user using OpenID Connect as well. And we run this. That's good so far. I press login. There is no registration in this demo. There is no registration because registering a user means making sure that the user gets registered in the identity server, and that's not part of my demo. So once again, I've outsourced all of my authentication needs to identity server. So if a user needs to register, they will have to register on the identity server. That's not a concern of mine. It's a concern of the identity server, the identity provider. So I press login. Press login. I end up here. Look at that. Identity server 4. It is not the most beautiful sign-in page I've ever seen, I must admit. Blame Brock or Dominic. I don't know who's actually built it. This is literally a demo thing off their GitHub account. So I've just downloaded some demo stuff. All of the UI stuff that you're seeing here with signing in and registering and all that you might want to do as a UI part of Identity Server is you building completely on your own. The only thing that they're giving you is a starter kit which looks like this, and then you can rewrite everything. And it's all just C# code in MVC controllers, and you can go in and do your worst. So I'm going to sign in here using zerocall and my magically short password. And I come back here and I'm signed in and everything is awesome, right? It is kind of awesome. I have all my claims. I have the user. I've issued everything that I need. And I have my spa. So if I go to my spa, it's going to look like this. I call my API. My API responds and says ID1. My spa, my API endpoint is not fantastic in any way, but it works. However, do not use cookie authentication for your APIs. There are issues with using cookie authentication with APIs. Cross-site request forgery and cross-site request scripting and stuff like that causes problems. So for APIs, we don't actually want to use the cookie authentication. We want to use something called bearer tokens. So we want to make sure that our JavaScript gets a token, adds that token to a header, and explicitly send my authentication to the API, and the API authenticates that token in the header and not the cookie. If we accept the cookie, anyone can force the user to go to an endpoint and that cookie will be sent. But if we do it explicitly through a header, it becomes much more secure. So just to demo how dangerous that can be, the demo I did now, that I can call it just using my cookie, I've left my API inside of my same application. If you leave that out and you put your API on a different domain or a different subdomain, you don't have the problem because your cookie won't be sent there. So you'll be stuck in not being able to use cookies anyway. But I've left it in here so it still uses authorized. It's still authorized the user. But I want to make sure that this API uses bearer tokens. So I'm going to go in here, and besides my add OpenID Connect thing here, I'm going to call add JWT bearer. So I'm going to support bearer tokens as well, or JSON web tokens over bearer authorization header. And I'm going to configure that. That was the wrong keyword combination. I want to configure that using IDS That's the one. Once again, I set up the authority. Who is going to be the person who has issued that token that the user is going to be sending to me? Well, that's localhost port 5000. And once again, don't you freaking go ahead and set that. Once again, doing it for demo purposes. And then I'm saying that only audience, only users that are allowed to access the API 1 API resource is allowed to access this thing. With that in place, I can go back to my API controller. In my authorize here, I can actually go and say authentication schemes. And I can tell it that, dude, for this thing, I'm only going to allow authorization using JSON web tokens and bearer tokens. So by adding that, I'm saying that anyone coming to this endpoint, I don't care if they've given me a cookie or if the cookie middleware says, or cookie handler says that I'm signed in, unless they are specifically authenticating using JSON web tokens, I'm not going to accept it. To get that to work, I need to make one final change. I need to go to my view, home, spa. And to do that, I'm going to just activate a sign in and sign out button. And I'm adding some code in here using another one of Brock's libraries called OIDC client. So OIDC client is a JavaScript client to handle authentication stuff. So what I'm doing in here is basically when we come into the page, I check to see if the user is already signed in. If that is the case, then I activate some buttons. When signing in, I tell the user manager from the OIDC client library to sign in the user. Signing out, I tell them to sign out using the OIDC client manager. And calling the API says that if there is a signed in user at the moment, add an authorization header and a bearer token to my request and make my request to the web server. I save that and I go out here, I refresh this. And yes, as I said, all the code is available for you to download and play with, excluding my secrets from Twitter and Facebook, which you will have in the recording. If I call the API now, it's actually going to give me a 401 unauthorized, because even though I am signed in, if I refresh this page, you'll see that I am signed in with my cookie, but the API is still saying, you suck, you're not signed in. So I need to explicitly say sign in, which pops up a window. That window shows me a sign-in page on the identity server, but I'm already signed in, so identity server just closes that page for me and signs me in. We can do this in a safe way silently as well. So we can actually ask OIDC client.js to say, can you go and see if the user is already signed in and give me a user, and it will do it in a hidden iframe instead, which is quite nice. So the user doesn't have to click login and all of that. We can do it silently. Then I call the call API. It now sends my access token in the authorization header to the server. The server authenticates that, sees that I'm authenticated, and allows me to call it. And if I sign out, my cookie gets removed, but I can still go to the spa, and the spa still says that I'm signed in. And if I call this, my authorization cookie, or my authorization header is still being sent, so I can still go ahead and call it using a bearer token. That was pretty much all of my demos. I've got 2 minutes if you have any questions. Not a single question. I know there's a lot to take in. I would suggest going and having a look at the code and playing around with it. All you need to do to get all of these things working in the demo that you can download there is to go to Facebook and Twitter, register an app, and get the user, the key and the app ID, and add those into the code. And all of my demos are pre-built, and you can just play around and see how it redirects and play around with it. And as I said, if there's anything else, you have the Pluralsight course as well. Other than that, thank you so much for listening. Feel free to come up and grab me if you have any questions, either now or throughout the conference. I'll be around the entire time.